No way. It can't be. No. Wait a second.
Global debt hits a new record in the second quarter of the year. It is now $307 trillion.
The three largest economies, the United States, China, and the euro area, will continue to stall.
Sounds terrifying and slightly unbelievable, right? In 2023, global debt reached $307 trillion. And you know what's even more shocking? Developed nations like the US, Japan, France, and the UK account for over 80% of this debt. So I asked myself, if even the most powerful economies take on this much debt, who will pay it back? And most importantly, what if a country can't pay it off? Yeah, well, obviously it goes bankrupt, but what happens to its currency? Businesses and people? Let's find out. Not only developing countries, but also world economic leaders are drowning in debt. The US leads the way with the highest national debt globally. The world's first economy owes $33 trillion, which is almost 11% of the global debt. Just think about it. There are around 200 countries in the world, and one of them is responsible for 1/10 of what all global economies owe. It might sound crazy, but it shouldn't be because, as you can see, the American GDP is the biggest one globally. In fact, the US accounts for 25% of the global GDP, which means that it is a huge economy. Still, the American national debt is higher than its GDP, and the global debt is also higher than the global GDP. How could something like this happen? Let's start by exploring what global debt is. Global debt is all the money borrowed worldwide by the government, companies, and individuals. It covers everything from state bonds and business lending to mortgages and personal credit cards. So if you or I take on any loans, we will also become part of the global debt. But why do countries need loans? Every government has its own spending, which covers everything from building new roads to paying for government assistance programs. And then there is the revenue every country gets, which mainly comes from taxes. When spending is higher than revenue, a government gets a deficit, and there are essentially three ways to cover it. 1, cut expenses. 2, increase revenue. And the third option is to take on debt. It seems like many countries choose the third option. Global debt isn't a new concept at all. Almost all governments started to take loans from their inception. This also happened in the US. The first American debt of $75 million dates back to 1791. It was accumulated during the Revolutionary War. And surprisingly, once in history, the US national debt got back to zero. It was in 1835 when Andrew Jackson was president. He called the debt a national curse and set a goal to pay it off. And after 6 years in the office, he managed to do just that. To achieve that, the government sold federally owned Western lands and blocked the infrastructure spending. But later, the US quickly started to take on debt again, reaching millions, billions, and eventually trillions. Anyway, if you want to know more about how the American debt works, check this video after watching this episode. Now, let's go back to the global debt. Even though countries took loans on their own for a long time, there was no concept of global debt until financial globalization, which started in the late 19th centuries. Just so you know, in 1913, before World War I, the global debt accounted for 29% of the global GDP. Just to put it into perspective, now it is over 300%, meaning that global debt is 3 times larger than the world's economy. Again, how did we get here? World War I, the Great Depression, World War II, the 2008 crisis, COVID, and the other economic troubles in between. All that turbulence led to the enormous global debt we face today. There's nothing wrong with the debt itself, though. Everyone borrows money. Countries, banks, companies, and people. If you and I take a loan, we will have to pay it back. It's obvious. Yet, who will pay back all these national debts? You see, global debt, it's like a giant puzzle where each piece represents countries, governments, businesses, and people. And each piece holder is in charge of handling and paying back their debt. Governments use taxes, borrowing, and economic policies to manage national debt. Meanwhile, corporations and individuals negotiate with creditors. While there's no single person taking care of the global debt, organizations like the International Monetary Fund can help when countries face financial troubles. But they do it by lending more money, and governments will eventually have to pay that money back with interest. So, at the end, debt owners are the ones responsible for what they owe, and no institution can change that. While the debt isn't an issue, the size is. Now, the global debt is much bigger than the world's economy, and countries can still borrow more. Can it last forever? Yes and no. There are two sides to this question, internal and external. The internal factors mostly refer to the debt ceiling. While every person living in the US knows these two words as a reason why Republicans and Democrats fight every once in a while, in reality is just the limit that sets the maximum amount that a country can borrow.
We do need to raise the debt ceiling to avoid economic calamity.
Nowadays, only Denmark and the US have a fixed debt ceiling. Apart from the internal limitations, there's also an external factor that defines how much a country can borrow. It works very similar to how we go to the bank and get a loan. The first thing our lender will do is look at our credit score, right? While countries don't have a FICO score, they do have their own credit rating. It ranges from AAA, the most reliable borrower, to CCC, the least reliable one. That's why, for example, Australia, Canada, and Germany have the highest rating, while Pakistan and Ethiopia get a CCC. By the way, the US doesn't have a perfect score because of its debt ceiling wars. It was downgraded twice during the national debt debates, in 2011 and recently in 2023. Of course, it is nothing dramatic because the American economy is still a reliable borrower, but it definitely proves that political division doesn't benefit any country's image. Still, anyone will lend money to the US because of a good rating, whereas the countries with lower scores will either face higher interest rates or wouldn't receive any loan at all. Now, who in the world lends us money to the countries? Who do Americans owe $33 trillion to? It turns out that every country's debt is split between different holders. Let's take the American debt, for example. The share might vary, but overall, the biggest chunk of our national debt belongs to the public, meaning people, company, and institutions. Those who also have a big share are the Fed, which is okay because they're our central bank, but it isn't just the Federal Reserve. It is also a bunch of other countries. As of January 2023, the 5 countries that own the most US debt are Japan, China, the UK, Belgium, and Luxembourg. How do they lend us money though? It isn't like the Fed goes to other countries asking for a loan. Of course not. In fact, other countries sort of come to us to buy US treasuries, the same bonds that you and I can get. By the way, we have a video on how you can invest in them, so make sure you check it out after you're done with this one. But why do other countries want to buy these bonds? The answer is simple, because the US government is considered one of the safest borrowers on earth that always pays back. And even though the returns on treasuries aren't too high, other central banks are happy to park their country's money in the US economy, roughly speaking, and save their funds from inflation without risk. Apart from foreign debt owners, the US debt is held by the US state and local governments, mutual funds, pension funds, insurance companies, etc. And something like this is quite common in all other countries. The US has always paid off its debt, but what if other governments cannot afford it? What will happen then? Well, first of all, any government will try to reduce their spending and get a higher revenue. How? By cutting on government investments, for example. This means reducing Social Security payments, stopping some infrastructure projects, or closing assistance programs. Another way to bring a country's budget in order is to lower the interest rates and hope that the economy will jumpstart. Or alternatively, a government can raise taxes to get higher revenue. But what if all of this doesn't help? Then, most likely, a country will announce a default. This means that a government can't manage its obligation and pay off its debt. This scenario is no good because the financial situation gets messy with prices rising and many people losing their jobs. Plus, a government default can block a government access to borrowing for years, and future loans might get very expensive. Still, everything is survivable, and many countries have proved it. While the US has never defaulted, 147 other governments did. Spain, for example, faced 6 bankruptcies. By the way, it became the first country to default on its loan in 1557. Portugal announced default 4 times, while Venezuela and Ecuador shared records with 11 and 10 times respectively. Even though default isn't an easy situation to navigate, some governments prove that it is possible to recover pretty fast. How fast is that? A great example is Iceland. It faced huge consequences after the 2008 financial crisis, leading to a debt default. But the government didn't back down. They assumed control over the banks, tightened their money flow, and focused on sustainable sectors like tourism and clean energy. Just like that, by the end of 2010, they managed to stabilize the situation. And today, Iceland's debt-to-GDP ratio is only 37%. And the debt-to-GDP ratio is an important indicator. It is much more relevant than the size of the debt itself. There are some countries that have a couple of $1 billion in debt and are still on the edge of bankruptcy, while 2 of the biggest economies in the world, the US and China, have the highest national debt of all countries. Why? Mainly because governments can use their loans for different purposes. It's like the good and bad debt we talk about in this channel. If I would go now and use my credit card to buy expensive clothes, eat out, and book a vacation, it will be considered a bad debt. But if I take a loan to invest in real estate or in my business, generally speaking, it is a good debt that will bring financial returns. Believe it or not, countries can do the same. Of course, they won't go and buy clothes or go on vacation, but they can spend the money they borrow or something that doesn't really boost the economy. And it isn't always a bad thing. But there is a difference when governments decide to invest in parks to reach their environmental goals or support small businesses. There's nothing wrong with planting more trees, but will this help you during a crisis? Not really. But if a country helps business owners, they can expand the economy and hire more people, which increases the GDP. That's why the debt-to-GDP ratio is a crucial factor that tells whether the government can easily handle its debt. A low ratio means a strong economy that can repay obligations, and vice versa. For example, Venezuela's debt-to-GDP ratio is 350%, while Estonia has it at 18%. But it isn't the only important factor because the high debt-to-GDP ratio doesn't always mean a weak economy. Take the US, for example. The American debt-to-GDP ratio is about 129%. It is pretty high, but still, the US accounts for about 10% of the global debt. The high GDP of $80,000 per capita compensates for this difference. And while there are no debt-free nations, Hong Kong, Kuwait, and Brunei have debt-to-GDP ratios lower than 5%. As you can see, every country is different. And the truth is that even high national debts aren't bad if they're used to grow and expand the economy. It is important to talk about this so that we all better understand how the system works. We often see scary headlines in the media, but sometimes they are very far from reality. And by knowing how the economy works, you will definitely avoid unnecessary pain. If you learned something new in this video, share it with your friends and family to spread the knowledge. See you in the next video. Bye-bye.